Okay, we're a little behind. We have to catch up a little bit. We're on 30A3, Lamed Amud Aleph. Lamed Amud Aleph, all the way on the bottom. So the last thing we discussed was a little bit of a technical discussion about language. Okay, so we had Rav Huna come along and say when a person says that bread is forbidden for me to eat, then you are allowed to make an eruv with it, because the goal of an eruv, yes, technically you could eat it, but more importantly, you want to benefit from it. And therefore, as long as it has some value to you, it could still be used as an eruv. However, if I say this bread is completely forbidden to me, then that bread cannot be used for an eruv. And the problem is that yesterday we finished learning a brisa, which when we finished reading it, because there were some issues with how to read it, but when we finally finished reading it, it basically went against Rav Huna. It told us that if a person says, that even if a person says, this bread is forbidden to me, we almost ignore the person. We assume he didn't mean, or she didn't mean, that it's forbidden to the person entirely. Rather, the person meant, I don't want to eat it. I forbid myself from eating it, but I could have benefit from it. And therefore, what the brisa said is that if a person says, this thing is forbidden for me entirely, I could still use it as an eruv. Whereas Rav Huna said, if I say it's forbidden for me entirely, I cannot use it as an eruv. So we have a problem because Rav Huna, who is an Amora, he is again the later generation, right? We always have to keep this in mind. The Amoraim, the people from later generations, cannot argue with those from the earlier generations. Rav Huna is an Amora, later generation. He can't argue with the Tanaim, who are from that earlier generation. This brisa seems to contradict his view. So what we end up doing, as we're about to show, is that yes, this brisa contradicts him, but there is another Tana, another person from that earlier generation, who has the same view, and therefore we could go like that. Your eyes are telling me that what I'm saying is crazy.
But this seems to be different from what you say about a Nazir. You can make an error for a Nazir even though the Nazir can't.
Good. We're going to get into that. Good. Hold that thought. So it says the Gemara, Huda Amar Rabbi Eliezer. So Rav Huna holds like Rabbi Eliezer, Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer. They're at the top of the second column on 38.3. Shvuah lo ochel kikar zo. If a person says, I will not eat this bread, Eruvin lo ba, we do make the eruv for it. However, if he says, kikar zo alai, this bread is prohibited to me in all respects, Eruvin lo ba, we do not make an eruv for it. So basically, we see Rabbi Eliezer is consistent with, Rav Huna is consistent with Rabbi Eliezer, and now we say, yes, there is a brisa which is not like Rav Huna, but we have Rabbi Eliezer who is like Rav Huna, and therefore Rav Huna is sitting pretty. However, now we have another contradiction, because on the one hand, we just established Rabbi Eliezer makes that distinction, and yet we have another brisa which seems like Rabbi Eliezer says differently. We'll ask the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer Hachi, does Rabbi Eliezer really say this? Vatani was taught in a brisa. Zeha klal is the general rule. Adam oster atzmo ba'ochel. When a person prohibits eating a food, ma'arvin lo ba, then we do make an eruv. Ochel haneser lo adam. But if a person prohibits themselves from the food entirely through a neder, through a vow, then a ma'arvin lo ba. Okay, then the Gemara, then the brisa continues. Rabbi Eliezer says no. Kikar zo alai. If a person says this bread is completely prohibited to me, all benefits ma'arvin lo ba, we still allow you to use that bread as an eruv. And we just established a moment ago, Rabbi Eliezer made that distinction. He said, when I say that eating is forbidden, then it's permitted to use it for an eruv. When I say it's forbidden for me entirely, I cannot use it as eruv. And over here, Rabbi Eliezer is saying, Kikar zo alai, if I say this bread is completely prohibited to me, ma'arvin lo ba, then you do make an eruv, right? So there's a contradiction, Rabbi Eliezer.
I'm sorry, I'm confused because I did listen to this morning.
Yeah.
What do you mean by, let's say it's like bomba, and you'll die if they open it near you because it's like you're that allergic to peanuts.
Right.
That's forbidden, but that's not forbidden.
No. So that's a separate discussion, which a person can eat something. Here we're talking about something a person is able to. Halachically, a person is able to. We highly discourage it. It's highly problematic. But a person go ahead and make a vow. Say, a vow. These are all vows. The discussion over here is a person making a subjective prohibition on themselves. It's prohibited to me. Meaning, we're not talking about something which is intrinsically prohibited. We're not talking which is the nazir piece, or we're not talking about a person going ahead and having they can't eat this food. Which we sort of did touch upon. We talked about things which are really like an onion, onion leaves or whatever, if it's very dangerous to the person, what the halacha is over there. But here we're talking about a person who is subjectively making a prohibition upon themselves.
Like an alcoholic and alcohol?
That could be an example, but that, no, we're talking about meaning that's still not halachically, it's bad for the person. Here a person goes ahead and says, I take upon, there's this formula, so I'm not without the formula, I prohibit myself from using Kleenex tissues. Meaning we're not just because, and the reason I hesitated when you said alcoholic was because sometimes that happens in that scenario where a person will say, I want to help myself stay away from something, so they'll go ahead and make a vow. Right. So that's a practice. But a person theoretically go ahead and say, I don't want to use Kleenex tissues. Just because. That would be a vow. A vow is I have the power with my mouth to go ahead and create prohibitions upon myself.
Oh, okay.
whole set of laws in the Torah. Okay, so the Gemara asked again, contradiction, Rabbi Eliezer. Let's just finish the brisa. The brisa said, "Kikar zo hektish ema arvin loba," whereas Rabbi Eliezer said that if a person prohibits the bread, then you could use it when it comes to hektish. If it's bread that's consecrated, then he would agree that you cannot make an eruv l'fisha ema arvin lo bekdeshos. You can't make an eruv with consecrated items. Okay, fine. But the bottom line is, the Rabbi Eliezer, there's a contradiction within Rabbi Eliezer. On the one hand, we're saying that he makes that distinction of Rav Huna, who distinguishes between food prohibited from eating versus prohibited entirely. And in this brisa, even when he says prohibited entirely, we almost like ignore him and we assume he didn't really mean prohibited entirely. He just meant prohibited from eating, and therefore it can be used. So how do we reconcile? The Gemara answers, as we do sometimes, Terei, Tanai, Valibet, Rabbi Eliezer. You keep in mind that all of what we have over here is not, the Mishnayos were not written at the time frame that these people lived. These traditions date back hundreds of years before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi writes down the Mishnayos, and you have people who have, let's say you have a bunch of people who are students of Rabbi Eliezer or a Meir or Rabbi Kiva, and then they pass on the traditions, and sometimes, due to a whole host of reasons, they had conflicting traditions from their teachers. So Gemara says, yeah, we have two traditions from Eliezer, one meaning from two different students. One student recalls Rabbi Eliezer saying X, which is consistent with Rav Huna. One student recalls Rabbi Eliezer saying Y, which is not consistent with Rav Huna. And bottom line is, Rav Huna is sitting pretty because at least we have a Tanaic version that matches with him. Okay, now we get to the Nazir case, which Jesse was bringing up. Ma'arvin l'Nazir b'yayin. So the Mishnah said you're allowed to make an eruv for a Nazir with wine, and we'll see why in a moment. Masnistan's lo Beis Shammai. However, before we get there, we point out that our Mishnah does not go like Beis Shammai. Why? The Tanu started in Brisa. Beis Shammai omrim ma'arvin l'Nazir b'yayin u'Yisrael b'truma. Beis Shammai says we're not allowed to make an eruv for a Nazir with wine or for Yisrael with truma. Right? Truma is kohanic food. It's food that's only allowed to be eaten by Kohen. You can't use that for an Eruv for Yisrael. And similarly, Beis Shammai says you can't make an Eruv for Nazir with wine. A Nazir is someone who has specifically vowed from wine, and some other things, but specifically wine being one of them. Beis Hillel disagrees. Beis Hillel Omer Ma'arvin l'Nazir b'yayin Yisrael b'truma. You are allowed to make an Eruv for Nazir with wine and for Yisrael truma. Amr lahan Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel proves his point. He turns to Beis Shammai, so to speak, and says, "Iatemodim, don't you agree?" 30b1. We're up to Lamed Beis. Amud Beis. Don't you agree to me? He says, let's say Yom Kippur. How do you make an Eruv on Yom Kippur? What is an Eruv made of? Food. Guess what? You can't eat the food. Why is that any different than a Nazir? Nazir can't eat wine, can't drink wine, and yet you're saying he can't. It's not going to be a good. It's not going to be a good Eruv. But you agree. You agree that on Yom Kippur you make an Eruv with food, even though we're talking about adults who are fasting, right? So Amrlan Abel, Beis Shammai says yes. So Amrlan Kishem. So Beis Hillel finishes his argument. He says Kishem Arvin Legadol b'Yom Kippurim, Kach Ma'arvin l'Nazir b'Yan Yisrael b'Truma. So what's the difference? Just like you make an Eruv for an adult on Yom Kippur or at the eve of Yom Kippur, as Yom Kippur begins, even though the food cannot be eaten on. Now, why is it a good Eruv? So Beis Hillel's arguing the reason it's good Eruv is, granted the adults can't eat it, but the adults could go and give it to a child who is allowed to eat it. Children don't have to fast on Yom Kippur. So the same thing. A Nazir can make an Eruv with wine. The Nazir can't drink it. Fine. The Nazir could get it and give it to someone else who's not a Nazir. So it's the same principle. Beis Shammai says, no, you're missing something. Beis Shammai says, Hasam ika su'uda haru'uya mimod yom. Beis Shammai says, no. The individual who is using the Eruv has to be able to eat the Eruv. So what about Eruv? What about Yom Kippur? He says because when the Eruv begins right before Yom Kippur. The Eruv kicks in, and we're starting to touch upon this principle, and that is that the Eruv, the status of the Eruv is defined by how it is as the right before the holiday begins, right before Shabbos begins, and therefore right before Yom Kippur, the person, an adult, is allowed to eat. It'll be right before Yom Kippur, and therefore it is fit for the gadol right before, as it's about to begin. Whereas for a Nazir, it's never fit for the person, and therefore, it's not going to be the same thing. Meaning, right, Beis Hillel says the reason the Eruv is good on Yom Kippur, even though it's food, is because you give it to a minor. And that would be the same thing as a Nazir giving their wine to a non-Nazir. Beis Shammai says it's nothing to do with being able to give it to a child, being able to give it to someone else. It's that we define it by as the holiday or Shabbos begins, and as the holiday or Shabbos begins, a regular person is able to eat food. A Nazir can't drink that wine, right? So hasam ika seuda yom, hachaleka seuda yom. When it comes to Yom Kippur, you're able to eat it while it's still day, and therefore it's a valid eruv. When it comes to Nazir and Truma, it cannot be eaten before the day begins. Okay, ask the Gemara. Points out the Gemara. This tradition of Beis Shammai, who says it has to be food that can be eaten by the individual, this does not go like Hanania. Hanania is going to have a far more stringent view of Beis Shammai. Now, what we're talking about over here is eruve tchumen. We're talking about what that means is that a person has their city. There's city beyond this. You're not allowed to go beyond the city limits, 2,000 amos, unless you go ahead and you set aside. What we typically do is we'll set a little bit of food. Right? So, right, in other words, a way to make it Erev Tchumen, if you want to go beyond the city limits of Baltimore, I don't know where that is right now, but the bottom line is you want to go beyond the city limits. So what you'd be allowed to do is you could set aside a little bit of food for yourself somewhere within the 2,000 amos outside of the city, beyond the city limits, and then that would make it like you started Shabbos there because that's your home. That's the place that you live because your food's there, right? So we define it as if that's where you're starting Shabbos, and then you have 2,000 amos from that place. So often, so again, historically, not anymore, but back in the day when I was in Eretz Yisrael, and then it was still questionable even, but certainly earlier when it wasn't so built up by Mount Washington, by Mount Wilson. It's been a while. Fine, by Mount Wilson, it wasn't so built up. There wasn't so many houses. So if we wanted to go from the yeshiva to towns like Pikesville, then we'd have to set up an Erev Tchum. We'd leave like a bottle of Powerade or something like that, sitting in some place, whatever, in a place. And then it's as if I started Shabbos in that place because it's my food. So it's as if I started there. And then my Erev gets defined, and I have another 2,000 amos, and that would get me over the hump. That would put me into Pikesville. Then once I'm in another city, I'm allowed to walk into that other place. Okay? The Gemara. So we've been talking about, so these things about can you use food on Yom Kippur? Could you use, the Nazir use wine? So we basically established that Beis Shammai says you can use food. It just has to be food that you could eat. We're about to see Beis Shammai actually has a much more stringent view that we weren't aware of. It says the Gemara, "Command look Chananya." This Gemara does not go like Chananya. The Tanya Chananya Omer, Kol Atzman Shel Beis Shammai Lo Hayamod Me'erev Ad Sheyotzim Mitaso Akcholchlei Tashmishav L'Sham. Beis Shammai says, yeah, theoretically you could have an Erev Tchumen, but in other words, to do it, it's not. You can't establish your residence with a bottle of juice. With a piece of matzah. That's not your residence. If you had a piece of matzah on the street, that's your residence. He says, no. If you want to sit up Erev Tchumen, you know what you need to do? Take your bed there, take your clothes there, take everything you need for Shabbos, which is very logical, right? It's an extreme view, but it's very logical. He says, now you're actually living there, and therefore, even if you didn't start Shabbos there, but your bed is there, your clothing is there, okay, then you have a good Erev Tchumen. But less than that, it doesn't work. So our discussion above does not fit like that view, because the discussion above had Beis Shammai saying, okay, you don't have to put your bed, it's just to be food that you're able to eat. But now, according to Chananya, actually, Beis Shammai actually had a much more stringent view. Okay? Kaman Azla, with that in mind, ask the Gemara, Kaman Azla to Tanya, who does the following brisa go like? Era b'shchorim. If a person made an erev while they were wearing black clothing, lo yetzi b'lvanim, they can't go out with white clothing. B'lvanim, if they made an erev with wearing white clothing, lo yetzi b'shchorim, they can't go out wearing black clothing. Okay, so what's going on over here? Kaman, who does this go like? Amar Rav Nachman Yitzchak, Chananya hiva libde Beis Shammai. This is Chananya going like Beis Shammai. And what this means, the way to understand this is it's not about white or black. The point is that it's the clothing that the person actually needs on that day. Again, in other words, Beis Shammai's view is you really need to have what you are using that day is what makes your erev. And therefore, if you want to be wearing black clothing, and you make your erev with white clothing, with something you're not going to be wearing, that doesn't sufficient. That's not a good erev. Your erev has to be with the things they are actually going to be wearing. Ask the Gemara, but according to Chananya, are you allowed in a situation? The Gemara now is inferring as follows: if let's say you set up your erev with black clothing, and you want to wear on Shabbos white clothing. Again, black and white, like blue, green, or this suit, that suit. But the point is that you set up your erev with black clothing. Like that you set up the erev, like you left black clothing there, let's say. And now you would just say, oh, you know what? I actually want to wear white clothing. Okay, I want to wear white clothing in that space. So the Gemara implies you can't wear white clothing because you set up the erev with your black clothing. It has to be your real everything you're using. So you could wear your black clothing. The Gemara asks, according to Beis Shammai, you shouldn't even be able to wear any clothing. Why? Because if the clothing that you really need to wear is not there, then according to Beis Shammai, your erev should be deficient. The same way that if your bed is not where you need your bed to be, your erev is deficient. So too, if you put the wrong piece of clothing, it's not only that you now have to wear different clothing, it's the whole erev is gone. Because the thing that you need, if your Shabbos clothes, right? If your Shabbos clothes not there, you can't wear your jeans and t-shirt because there's something wrong with your erev, right? So the Gemara says, Sahachi Kamar. So the Gemara says, you're right. This is what we mean. Erev b'lvanim v'hutzrach l'shcharim. If you made an erev designating white clothing. And on Shabbos, you need to wear black clothing. That's what we wear on Shabbos. Af bilvanim lo yetze, then you're not even allowed to go with white clothing because the whole Eruv is deficient, because you don't have what you really need. And Kaman, who does this go like? Amar Rav Nachman Yitzchak Chananya V'Aliv Beis Shammai. It's Chananya like Beis Shammai. Okay, fine. Now that we've discussed Beis Shammai, now we're going to move on to the opinion of Sumchis, which was also mentioned in our Mishnah. Sumchis said a very interesting thing. Sumchis said we have like three different views. We had one view of the Chachamim who said, the Tanakama who said that a Nazir you're allowed to make a Nazir is allowed to make an Eruv with wine, and a non-Kohen is able to make an Eruv with hektish, with food that's with truma, food that's consecrated to a Kohen. And then we had Sumchis who said this very interesting view in the middle. Sumchis Omer Bechulin V'Ilu Nazir B'Yayin Lo Palig. So Sumcha says that you are allowed to make a. So the Tana before Sumcha said that a Kohen that a Yisrael. Sorry. I should get the board out again. Okay, Sumcha said that a Yisrael can't make an Eruv with truma. A Yisrael can't make an Eruv with truma, and a Nazir can't make one with wine. Sumcha said bechulin. Sumcha said that an Eruv may be made only with non-sacred food. V'ilu Nazir b'yayin l'palig. When it comes to a Nazir, he says you could use wine, right? So Sumcha says this interesting hybrid, interesting view which we need to unpack. Sumcha says a Nazir is allowed to make an Eruv with wine, even though he can't drink the wine, and a non-Kohen is not allowed to make an Eruv with truma. That seems to be inconsistent. Which one is it? If you hold I have to be able to eat it right now, then it should be both Nazir and Truma. If you hold I don't have to eat it, again, both. But he distinguishes. He says, Nazir, yes, a Nazir is allowed to set aside wine, but a non-Kohen can't set aside Truma. How do you differentiate? So as says Gemara, Afshir to Mitchell and Nizirus say, so Gemara says, no, very simple. A Nazir is allowed to go to a rabbi on Shabbos, and basically you could annul a vow. And since you can annul the vow of Naziros, even if he doesn't do so, but since theoretically if a person makes a vow, then there are oftentimes loopholes, what we call, whatever, without getting into details, there's a way of annulling the vow on Shabbos. So therefore the Gemara says, since the Nazir could annul the vow, therefore he'd be allowed to set aside wine, because even though he's not able to drink it right now, but theoretically he could go ahead and annul the vow. Ask the Gemara, Truma also, you're able to annul the vow. What you're able to do, if I designate something as Truma, I'm able to go to a group of rabbis, and basically say, with some explanation, and they're able to undo that sanctity. And because essentially the way I make something truma is a form of a vow. I say this is truma, but theoretically if there was a mistake, I could go and explain the mistake, and they could annul that vow, and I'd have to go give truma on something else, right? But I'd be able to do the same thing. So the Gemara says no. The Gemara says there's a difference. If the Nazir annuls his vow, we're on 30b2 now. If the Nazir annuls his vow, then the wine becomes completely permitted to him. If a Yisrael goes ahead, let's keep in mind how it works with food. I reap my heart, I gather my grain from whatever, I take my produce, and now I have to, all that food, am I allowed to eat the food before I give any of the maestros? Absolutely not. That food is called tevel, okay? What happens after, with tevel, is I'm not allowed to eat it, no one's allowed to eat it. I go and I start giving the tithes, I give to the Kohen, I give this tithe, I give that tithe, the maestros, and then the food is able to be eaten. So Gemara says, if a person was shoel on their net, if the person annulled their vow on Shabbos, the Nazir did, then the wine is completely permitted to him. If you annul your truma vow, granted it's not truma, but now you have another problem, it's called tevel. Because now the food is untithed, no one can touch it, right? So that's problematic. So the Gemara says, it becomes tevel, and therefore no one can eat it. So the Gemara says, no, but you could also do fine. I make it into tevel, right? I ask the rabbis, okay, please annul this vow. It's no longer truma, now it's tevel. I can't eat it, but I can then go ahead and say, okay, but I'm going to be mafresh truma. I can still be mafresh truma, not based on the food over here, but I can mafresh truma. I have food somewhere else. I have food somewhere else, and I say, 2% of the food I have at home, my box of whatever, the grain that I have at home, that should be designated for a Kohen as truma. You could do that. You're allowed to. You don't have to have necessarily the food in front of you when you take some of it truma. If you have, let's say, 100 sheaves of wheat, you could say, and 2 sheaves that I have at home are going to be designated truma. I don't have to take it from the truma in front of me. Okay? Says the Gemara, yes, technically you could do that. However, lo nechshu chaver litrum shlom amukaf. There is a rabbinic, not prohibition, but it's bad practice. It's bad rabbinic. it's bad etiquette to go ahead and take truma from somewhere else over what you have over here. The proper way to do it is if I have a pile of 100, I take from this 100. And therefore the Gemara says that we're not going to assume the person's going to do that. So the Gemara says, fine. Fine. So you have tevel, take just a little bit from it and give it to the Kohen. You can still, you have your matzah, which you designate as truma. And now initially you couldn't eat it. But technically you could ask, you could undo the truma. Now it's back to tevel. So he said, okay, you can't eat tevel, but still on Shabbos I could say 2% of this matzah should be given to truma, and therefore it's okay. The Gemara says, delays bashiura. The Gemara says, no, you can't do that because maybe the person has just the bare minimum of what's needed to eat truma. And for the Eruv. In other words, you can only do that if you have the Eruv plus extra food that you can designate for truma. But let's say you only had 2 matzahs, which is enough for 2 meals. You can't go ahead and say, well, 1% of each matzah is going to be given to truma. Then you don't have enough for your Eruv. So there's another problem. The Gemara says, that's crazy. Umay paska. What, the person really gives the exact amount for the Eruv? That makes no sense. So the Gemara is back to the question. What is the difference? Why can't, just like some of this holds, that the person could be shoel, the person could be, matir his neder of Nazirus, why can't the person be matir the neder of Truma, and then go ahead and tithe the food that's in front of you? Because presumably you don't have just the bare minimum you need for the 2 meals, you presumably have a little bit more. So say, 2 meals worth of this are going to remain, chulin, and I'm going to take 1 tiny percent and give it to the Kohen, and then the food is all kosher, all edible. So when it says, Al Sumchas Sabalak Rabbanan, Sumchas holds like the Rabbanan, Darmi Kal Davar Shehu Mishum Shvus, Gazra Labin Hashmashos. He holds that anything that was prohibited by rabbinic decree is forbidden bein hashmashos. Okay, so what that means is as follows, and that is that there is a big discussion about what you're allowed to do between sunset and nightfall. Okay, it's clearly much more lenient than after nightfall. After nightfall, it's definitely Shabbos. But after sunset, what we call Bein Hashmashos, literally between the suns, when the sun goes down and the moon's coming up, that time period is called Bein Hashmashos. The question about what you're allowed to do, there are typically, most opinions hold, there's a significant amount of leniency. So for example, Amir La'akum, if you're asking a non-Jew to do something for you, there are many prohibitions, but Bein Hashmashos, there are a lot of leniencies that we wouldn't otherwise have. That's just one example. But Sumchas holds, no, even things which are forbidden rabbinically can't be done Bein Hashmashos. So why is that relevant over here? Because one of the things you're not allowed to do rabbinically is be mafresh truma, separate truma, and therefore since the Eruv kicks in, it becomes effective bein hashmashos at this particular time, and since you can't separate truma at this time, so granted you can ask a rabbi to annul the status of truma, but then what would you have to do? You'd have to go and be mafresh truma. It's something you're not allowed to do rabbinically bein hashmashos. Therefore, whereas a nazir could ask and make his take away his Nazirite status, and therefore make the wine permitted. However, if a Yisrael were to go ahead and say, hey, make this thing not truma, like I be shol my neder, can we be matu neder, and we make it no longer truma, that what you'd have to then do is then go separate truma, and that's something which is rabbinically prohibited on Shabbos. Okay, let's go a tiny bit further. Lema kaman azla hadatan. Who does the following Mishnah go like? Yesham rakalafi mashu adam. Okay, let's just go a little further. Yesha Amru, Kalafi Mashu Adam. There are things which are according to the person. Okay, meaning, if a Kohen goes ahead and brings a meal offering, you have to bring a handful of flour, and that's going to be the handful of the Kohen. And when you have 2 handfuls of incense, which the Kohen brings on Yom Kippur, the measurement is not an objective measurement. It just depends on how big the Kohen's hands are. And one who drinks a mouthful of water on Yom Kippur, or any drink on Yom Kippur, it depends on how big the person's mouthful is. And the 2 meals of the Eruv are measured by the individual. Kiman, who does it go like? Who does this Mishnah go like that says everything is according to the individual? Amr Avzer Sumchasi, it goes like Sumchas to Amr Mai Dechazi Le Be'inan, that we require what is suitable for the individual. Right? Sumchas was the one who said that it has to be something which is fit for the individual themselves. Meaning the Nazir, the Truma has to be able to be eaten by the Yisrael. It's not enough that he could give it to a Kohen, it has to be eaten by the Yisrael. Similarly over here too, the Gemara is saying that since the meals for the Erev has to be the right amount that a person eats. If a person's a big person, larger. If a person's small, a person has a big appetite, larger. If it's a person has a smaller appetite, smaller. That is consistent with Sumchas' view. Just like Sumchas holds that a person has to be able to eat the food, so too has to be food that is fit for the person. If the person has a big appetite, you have to make sure that the Erev has a large amount of food to fit for that person's appetite. That is the view of Sumchas, and we're going to analyze it a tiny bit further tomorrow, God willing. Have a great day.